Okay, a couple. Hey, you don't all have to answer telepathically at once. It's going to be a nightmare once we all have Elon Musk Neuralink and everyone. Anyway, our next panel is called What's on Your Mind? How the immersive internet affects how you perceive reality, memory, and emotions. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Doug Thompson and Sasha Wallinger. Doug has been working in the metaverse for 17 years, has a wealth of experience in the field. He has supported military amputees, developed social support networks, and created virtual innovation tools for enterprise. Doug is the founder of Nario, a platform that helps creators engage with fans and communities in creating narrative worlds. His work has been recognized by clients like Sony Music, UEFA, and People Magazine, amongst many others. As the metaverse continues to grow, Doug believes the ability to tell immersive narratives will be a driving force of innovation. I'm excited to hear what Doug has to say. I hope you guys are all equally as excited. Please come up to the stage. Our other speaker is Sasha Wallinger. For over a decade, Sasha has been at the forefront of weaving together the physical, digital, and virtual in luxury, premium, and pop-up culture ecosystems. She has worked in-house at companies like H&M, Nike, and Sorel. Has also been recognized for her work as a marketing and communications leader, having been awarded Chief Marketing Officer of the Year, awarded by the CMO Club. In her current role, Sasha helps heritage, fashion, and luxury brands connect with their audience using Web3 opportunities and also building community with clients and partners. I'm excited to hear what Sasha has to say. I hope you guys are too. Please welcome her up to the stage as well. I'll let you guys take it on.
Thank you. Sasha, it's good to meet you.
It's really nice to meet you too, Doug. Hi. Good evening, I guess.
Isn't this awesome?
Say. Good middle of the evening.
I just have to warn. Yeah, I have to warn everybody. It's like 1 a.m. here, and I'm in Laos, or Laos, depending how you want to say it, which is just to the east of Thailand. And I mention that partly because my connection here isn't always that great. So if I glitch out, just talk on top of me. But the other reason I mention it, we tend to think of the metaverse as this Ready Player One, super expensive goggles, super immersive games, but when you walk around Thailand or Laos or Sri Lanka, where I've also spent time this year, it's a different world, isn't it? And people are still on their relatively cheap Android phones. Not everybody has a laptop or all this expensive gear. And that's one end of the spectrum. And then you and I were chatting a little bit before. The other end of the spectrum, I think, is we're suddenly surrounded by all of this generative content and AI chatbots and all this beautiful artwork being generated by computers. So isn't it amazing how the metaverse, it encompasses such a huge diversity, from the folks I see here playing games on their Android phones, old Android phones, to some of the next level stuff that we're doing with AI. I don't think the metaverse is one thing, is it?
No, I think that's an excellent point, and I love that you're bringing us into a sort of reality, right? And a sense of both why we're here today to think about safety and to think about how we're ambassadoring various opportunities to connect with each other in a variety of ways, but it really does come down to developing a new sort of community, but thinking about how to bring in ideas and mechanisms that both worked well in our real life, IRL moments, but also maybe build and create it in new ways that we can really revitalize and continue that pathway of inspiration and creativity and wonder as we see some of these amazing different styles of avatars. And we were chatting a little bit. I'm very much interested in the the design and the fashion and the creativity cycles of all that we can capture. But that comes with a necessity for some, I won't say guardrails per se, but some ideas that are a little bit more, that we're talking about this week. So thrilled to be here and thrilled to bring in a very, what is becoming a global conversation, I guess, via you and I.
Absolutely. I was here last year too. It was just amazing. And the work that the safety initiative is doing is just so needed. I think I often look, I don't know who, I'm of a generation. I remember my first project was delivering a database on mag tape, and you had to take the database and put it on these big mainframe mag tape readers. But I also remember Facebook when it first came out, and I loved it when it first came out. And they had this little thing that you did where you could poke your friend. And, you'd log in again to see if anybody had poked you, especially to see if, the crush that you had poked you. And so this little interaction of poking and then later liking a post, they were these little tiny interactions, which at the time, it got your attention, it got you returning to the site, it created a sort of, I guess you can call it slightly addictive, but it gave you that little dopamine hit. And I think the thing that's interesting about the metaverse is that as we sit here today with what the metaverse is, and thinking of the keynote that was just given, it's a model of the metaverse that we have today, which may have unpredictable outcomes. And I think part of my premise to start with, and we chatted a bit about this, is that the metaverse today is not necessarily a good predictor of what the metaverse will look like 5 years from now, any more than those Facebook pokes, those initial interactions were a prediction of how gigantic social media would become and how it would create both tribes, silos of opinion. It would create waves of disinformation. You can't always predict where the metaverse is headed. And I think it's super interesting to try to visualize how the metaverse might be different from how we visualize it today. You and I were talking about it may be a little more surreal than this room that we're in right now. Remember chatting about that?
Absolutely, yeah, and I think you brought up this lovely parallel between literally surrealism and thinking about how that, in how those tools that we're given, and I just back up a pinch to think about in the sense of I came into to digital spaces, within digital marketing and thinking about building websites, right? And you mentioned Facebook. I remember MySpace and thinking about how much better we could do, right? And so then looking at these different tools that artists would be able to employ to optimize opportunities within the online spaces, these weird allegories of the physical that we were creating, but then thinking about why would people want to go online? And I know this is very archaic to the audience probably at hand. However, it's important to reflect on where we've gotten in such a short period of time. Doug, I know you've been in this space for quite some time, but it is relatively short holistically. And then we think about art movements, throughout history and time, surrealism, impressionism. Those were humongous game changers. And it felt, I'm sure, like the people, Picasso, Matisse, all of those artists were living in a time, Van Gogh, of vast rapidity, of speed. And they didn't have that global understanding that we do now and that same quickness and rapidity of speed. And I think that what's so exciting about this surreal, hyper real, whatever, questioning of reality, that's always a good pretense for evolution and developing this mind space of wonder and creativity. And that's what I so enjoy about this ecosystem, is having that open-ended question as to what will become, what will the future look like, but also how will we help to define that?
Yeah, that's interesting. When in the introduction, they talked about military amputees, which was about 17 years ago. So I've been kind of kicking around the metaverse for a long time. And we used virtual space in a couple of ways. One was that we created a space that they could own and that they could do their own stuff in. And we modeled it. We actually created it based on a background story, a backstory, a lore about this old abandoned South Carolina camp, and that this camp had been taken over by the U.S. military as a rehabilitation center for military amputees. So that when you went there, you had a sense of place, you had a sense that there was a history, things felt familiar to you. And then we extended that and we did something called veteran civilian dialogues, where we brought veterans and civilians together in virtual space to listen to each other. And in order to facilitate that listening process, we designed the space so that as you moved through it, through the course of this session, you started in something that was fairly intimate. You learned how to move, you learned how to move your camera, you learned how to use the chat and voice, and then you moved into a slightly larger space. And so this idea that you would start designing physical spaces towards human behavior was super empowering. And the use of an avatar as a proxy for identity, the feeling of safety that you can create when people feel like they have this avatar as I'm not going to call it a buffer, but as a way to express themselves without needing to feel physically vulnerable. So the metaverse, I think, can be used in super empowering ways, but it requires careful design, right? And on the other end of the spectrum, there's all of the safety concerns that you have, because anonymity can also be the source of danger. Intimate spaces can feel threatening to some people. So where does that leave the burden on a designer? What are the tools that we need? What do you think you talked about guardrails, but how does that design process work, that it is a new toolkit that references the physically real? How do we use those tools responsibly as designers, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are a lot of ways and a lot of examples. I was fortunate enough to work at Super Plastic when we were developing the Super Gucci NFT, which was a collaboration with the Gucci fashion house in celebration of their 100th year. And certainly there was, Gucci has a very interesting trajectory and strategic roadmap. I'm sure many in the room will have noted that they have appointed a head of Metaverse, almost like a de facto chief Metaverse officer at their fashion house late this year, to really put forward this sense of strategy and road mapping and the conveyance of a very iconic ecosystem of both in real reality, like a retail organism, but also a pop culture mindset, right? That certainly becomes iconic just by the virtue of saying the name. So that's a branded entity, and yet I think a lot of the impetus for Gucci moving forward into this metaverse Web3 ecosystem as a whole is due to the fact that there's a desire for a continuum of creativity. So I frequently say when I'm fortunate enough to speak with people like yourself, that the consumer is bored, but they're not stupid, and they're not undesirous of wanting to have an interplay and a dialogue, and as I mentioned earlier, a community with something like a brand. So when building for that type of ecosystem, not only do you do a transactional moment of let's say like an NFT, or having crypto being some capability for being purchased in store, but a whole trajectory, and that's why I'm bringing in strategy in this place, because I think it's really critical not to think about a one and done play, but really consider the thoughtful understanding of why we're going to show up in this Web3 space. And then we can begin to evaluate the how, and certainly with the thought around how consumers are going to interact, and what is a safe and what is a equitable and what is an authentic ecosystem and experience for them to come to. But also, how do we build then an opportunity to adapt and layer onto those places? There's going to be learnings, and so how do we allow yourselves to basically build the house with some room for extra bathrooms, as things grow, if you will. I think that's really critical.
Yeah, I love fashion as a reference point for a lot of this. It might not seem like the place that you find the boundaries of things like safety, but I think it speaks so much to identity, and it speaks to self-expression. And I think I'm hopeful that that's a big part of what the metaverse is this site for self-expression. I think, there's a few things that kind of strike me about when we imagine the future of the metaverse, and we often talk about it as being very, very big. I actually think that kind of history would tell us, and I'm actually quite hopeful about this, that the metaverse will have a lot of very, very small rooms, just 2 or 3 people sitting around telling stories, sharing about their day, maybe, creating something together. And so we tend to think of the metaverse as this thing with massive scale, but I also think it'll often be quite intimate, which I think is a hopeful sign for the metaverse, because when reality starts to be blurred, when we get to the point where your AR glasses makes walking down the street, you may run into a monster that isn't real as you walk into Gucci, right?
Right.
That we start to gravitate back to these small social circles and smaller tribes, which I think is kind of like, look at this room. It feels intimate to me. It feels like we're having an actual conversation. I don't feel like I'm lost in some endless doom scrolling Twitter or Facebook feed. So I think that's a hopeful thing about the metaverse. So how do brands and fashion, and how do you work realizing that you have these small communities? How do you create trust within those communities?
I think that's a really good question. And I think an honest answer is it's completely in the works. I think a lot of brands during the pandemic understood that they had no virtual presence with their audiences, and their doors were literally shut, both metaphorically and physically. And that was very risky, for any entity to continue to conduct business and also keep the fires brewing, let's say, from the sentiment and audience integration, and just caring about what would happen to these, some very big, others smaller. But what came out of that was actually really exciting in the sense of micro communities. So a lot of what you're talking about now, in the sense of being able to have an intimate conversation with an audience of engaged fans and followers, but also having a sense of the market segment growth and having a pulse as to being able to listen. And I think that reset was really, really important. We talked a little bit offline about the clean, well-lit room, and I'd love to hear more about your thinking there in the sense of ambassadoring this really bespoke, from working in fashion and luxury, there's this expectation to have a concierge service and really like person-to-person interaction that occurs at some, physical premium level. I'd love to hear your thoughts about how to ambassador that, and because I think that's a critical moment for us to build with reference towards.
Yeah, it was based on a interview that Tish Shoot did. Tish is kind of one of the early kind of bloggers about the metaverse. She did an interview with a guy named Eben Moglen, who was, I think he was the head of the Electronic Frontier Foundation, but he was talking about virtual worlds. And this is back 16 years ago. We were talking about interoperability. IBM was heavily involved. And now again, we're talking about interoperability. And the truth is, this is just a little footnote. The truth is, I think that many of the big problems of interoperability were actually solved 15 years ago, and we're just kind of reinventing the solutions. But what we discovered 15 years ago, 16, 17 years ago, was that the issue of interoperability wasn't technical. It wasn't really about getting avatars to work from one world to another. It was actually cultural, that the owners of these platforms didn't necessarily want interoperability because it went against their commercial interests. So out of that, even Moglen was talking about safety, and the term he used that has stuck with me ever since is, he said, I want the feeling of walking into a clean, well-lit room as I move through the metaverse. And what he meant by that was that as a consumer, as a user, as a player, as a person, that when I move through metaverse spaces, I want to feel that I could see the dark corners, that I could see that I have clarity in the spaces that I walk into. And this idea of a clean, well-lit room, he suggested, could in part be solved technically. And recently, the way that I wrote about this was I talked about avatars as repositories of our preferences. And that instead of us needing to agree to the platforms, that the platforms should agree with us. So think of it this way: you go to you download a new game, and you're presented with this big, gigantic terms and conditions, user license agreement. You have to sign it. You've never read it, but you have to sign it. But what if instead your avatar carried with you your safety preferences? So that when I enter a room, the platform owner reads my avatar's safety preferences, which says, I don't want nudity, I don't want violence, I don't want hyperrealism. Maybe I have a condition where blinking lights would cause a seizure. These are my preferences for safety. And it becomes the obligation of the platform owner to meet those preferences. Now, they could pop up something saying, I'm sorry, but this is a violent game world. So you need to know that I can't accept your requirements. So flip it on its head a little bit. So I can walk around with my preferences. The platform owners could say, Doug doesn't like violence. So when I present to him, I'm going to mute the violence. I think this flipping of responsibility to we are the citizens of the metaverse. We are citizens of the metaverse. We're not users, we're not consumers, but we're citizens of the metaverse. And therefore it's the platform owners who need to respond to our requests for safety, our preferences. We should be in the driver's seat. The person should be in the driver's seat rather than the platform owner.
Absolutely. I mean, I think I'm seeing a lot of emojis from the audience, and I would concur. I think that then you layer on top of that the role of the designer to be able to listen to that, the role of the builder to be able to create that, the role of the brand to be able to get the data insights, to be able to power through and make that something that's certainly an initiative, or just the kind, I'm not saying cost of doing business, but the way that things progress. That seems to me to be a very humane way of wanting to create a world that people want to enjoy. And I think that at the end of the day is what we're talking about when we talk about visiting a metaverse ecosystem. It's making something that's, frankly fun. I mean, I really think that part of this, especially in fashion, luxury, premium ecosystems, is about having fun and breaking down barriers towards fun and joy. That sometimes you don't necessarily see in that camp. The idea of that clean, well-lit room, because if you think of some of the best real IRL spaces, retailers are extraordinary. I mean, we love Apple stores because they're very clean, they're well lit, you know what to expect from them. There's not nooks and crannies that things can get lost in, right? And that experience comes in, and not that it's meant to be only a consumer brand liaison, but certainly there's a sanctity, and really, even if you think about a museum too, there's a moment that you can interact with a piece of art, and you want to do that in a clean, well-lit room as well. So I think that responsibility is well regarded across the spectrum of all of us who are creating and even thinking about creating ecosystems, and then looking with an eye of the future and thinking about, Gen Z, Gen Alpha, those up and coming Web3 natives. They're used to having an understanding of virtual connectivity and an intimacy as they select to engage, right? So it makes complete sense that as we're creating these ecosystems, we would transfer that type of ethos and aesthetic into spaces that we're creating for them to begin to inhabit too.
Yeah, and I mean, I'll speak very briefly about Naraya, which is my storytelling platform. And it's this idea, and I was again working on this a long time ago, was this idea that that storytelling is one of the most profound ways that we connect with each other as humans, but that the tools for storytelling weren't built in properly with the internet. Meaning that it's really difficult for you and I to collaborate, just two people, on writing a story and then figuring out how we monetize it, how we make money off of it. Let's say we want to just do a comic book, and I don't even mean we're setting it to be millionaires or anything, but there wasn't the proper infrastructure for collaborating, for engaging fans, fan art, modding, all of the stuff that happens around games and around books. And you think of like Harry Potter fan fiction, it sits outside of the franchise. And if we can bring all of that together, that's what Rio sets out to do. So I call it story tribes. And part of the reason I bring it up is I think this idea of story tribes returns us to those kind of joys that we may have had when we first got onto the internet, like back in the early days. We found our tribe and we told stories together. And this idea of story tribe, I think, potentially creates a trust layer. It creates community. We can gather around the tools for storytelling if they're developed the right way. And especially when you can't tell what's real or what's not real, when stories are going to be endless because AI will just generate endless stories. We need these little tribes to create social cohesion, I guess, is one way to say it. But then more broadly, as storytellers, I also think we have a role as citizens of the metaverse. And I use that term really like specifically. And just like the citizens of a country, not everybody is going to participate in their local government. But the fact that you're a citizen gives you the potential to take action over what your country, in this case, the metaverse, the shape that it can take. So I look around this room and I see the citizen activists for what the metaverse can become. It doesn't mean that we need everybody in the room, but there's no other room. There's no secret room somewhere where the future culture of the metaverse is being defined by some other person. We can each take that role. Like everybody who's in this room can actually take action on what the metaverse is going to look like. And I think that's incredibly exciting and incredibly empowering. But also it's like a responsibility that we have to carry and not think that somebody else is doing it for us, because we made that mistake, I think, with social media, that we just kind of trusted that these big silos would somehow figure it out. And we as the people in this room shouldn't trust that somebody else is figuring it out, that we have to figure it out as a group.
I love that. And I think having come from sustainability and the gamification of sustainability to scenario plan how we can make it was the pursuit of this time better, so that, think about the 7 generations, to leave things better for 7 generations ahead of all of those who will come after us. We're needing to think about that.
That's
too.
Awesome.
Yeah.
God, that's amazing. I love that long-term thinking, which we need more of, right? We really need more of it.
I think especially from these types of minds. Go ahead, yeah.
Are you optimistic? Or like, is this a renaissance period, or this is a period of great danger? Which is it?
I think I'm always a cynical optimist, perennially, right? And I think that there's so much to be. It's as I mentioned, with the likening it to art movements and even just any kind of awakenings of any time. There's so much to be relished during this period of time. I believe, and I feel like I have to believe in the future, to be able to know what's right, and also to be able to take what we leave and guide it to the next place. I do also see a lot of very interesting minds working in this space across, I'm not a technologist. I'm coming from fashion and art and in ecology, right? But the more cross-pollination of these different kinds of minds, from the physical, from architecture, from the built space, I think that can be really important to employ, even from legal disciplines and financial areas. Like, I think that as we look into this creativity, we certainly, you know, as I say, the cynical part of the optimism is to know that, you know, we're all making it up as we go in the best of ways. But certainly we're thinking about it and having these types of moments around safety and thinking about how we are impacting the future. That keeps me hopeful. What about you?
Absolutely. No, I'm optimistic. I'm always optimistic. Absolutely.
So guys, final thoughts on the topic at hand, please.
Well, I think we shared them. Yeah.
Yeah, I think it. Yeah, go ahead. I think it's a confusing time because there's so much that's changing, and that if we try to figure it out alone, by scrolling through Twitter, we're just going to reach a dead end. And I think the most important thing is the fact that there is this group of people in this room. That's how we're going to navigate these waves of change together.
Yeah, I would just add that I think, you know, we're all builders, right? You know, we're all creating, and there's that opportunity that Doug mentioned, that responsibility. But I also welcome that creativity, because creativity is messy and it's murky, and yet there's always this phoenix that can rise out of that. So I think that's really exciting, and I'm exhilarated by that.
Well, everybody, let's go ahead and give them a round of applause. Use your emojis, please. We are going to take a moment. We're going to reset the room, and we're going to have a 5-minute break. Emojis.
Thank you,
hearts
everyone.
And claps.
Yeah. Thanks so much. Thanks, Doug. It was a pleasure. Thank you, guys.
Thank you.